The European manufacturing base is so heavily now in the Far East that there is an interconnectedness and an interdependency between the theatres that means it's a fallacy to say they can be separated in terms of military strategy.
We are going to talk now about the Defence Review. And of course, Stephen from Cheltenham says, what do we need on UK soil? What do we need defending from? Cyber attacks, but an actual invasion, not as far as I can see. There needs to be a sensible discussion on defence. Mr. Healy was asked what the physical threats to the UK are we need defending from. That's actually from the same person. He sent me two texts, but luckily we have the chance to talk about this in some depth. As we were saying, the government has announced a new defence review to assess the current state of the armed forces and the UK's ability to respond to these threats. Lord Robertson, of course, the former NATO Secretary-General and the former Defence Secretary under the last Labour government, says Britain and NATO must be able to confront China, Russia, Iran and North Korea, who he says are increasingly working together. James Murray, who's the new Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, has told Times Radio that Labour puts national security at the very heart of what they're doing.
What we said in opposition, and now we're in government, is at the heart of how we approach government as well. We set out our absolutely ironclad commitment to NATO, to national security, to making sure that we're responding to the threats that we face. And that's why, as I said, the strategic defence review that the Prime Minister has announced and has been launched today is so important to make sure that we're ready for the threats that we face.
So joining me now is James Heappey, of course, the former Minister of State for the Armed Forces under the last government. Welcome to the show, James.
Hey, Ed, how you doing?
I think you were the longest-serving Minister for the Armed Forces, certainly for some considerable time.
For some time. Adam Ingham did it for longer than I did.
Anyway,
around the
that's
turn
a
of the
short
century.
way or a long way of saying that you know more about the armed forces
I know
than most people. You've recently come out of office. I mean, my instinct is we don't need a defence review because people kind of know what the issues are. What would you say?
Yeah, look, I think we've heard plenty of commentary to that effect. Patrick Sanders, as he was leaving office from heading the army the other week, effectively made that point that we've done an integrated review 4 years ago. We refreshed that after the Ukraine war 2 years ago. So this will be the third review of defence, foreign affairs and security inside 4 years.
Exactly.
And the problem with the MOD, this is not a point about the incoming ministers, but the MOD as a department loves reviews. Everybody wants to have strategy in their signature block. And so the moment that you allow everybody to sort of get into review mode, the focus is on that rather than implementing, and the world is quite busy at the moment, which is why there is a lot of merit in this being an external review, that George Robertson and a team of external reviewers do the thinking about what's next. In theory, I suspect, to leave the department to focus on the here and now. Whether or not you can persuade all of these people in the department who love to strategize to actually leave the future alone, discuss. But if you've announced that the landing point is 2.5% of GDP, and you've announced that the landing point is growth to the armed forces, a year-long review to sort of validate those conclusions feels slightly unnecessary.
Well, let's conduct our own defence review now and talk about some of the things that sort of I really would love to understand better, and I hope our listeners will as well. So one is manpower. 2.5% is
staffing, as it's called nowadays.
So people say 73,000. It's lower than it's ever been before the Napoleonic Wars. It seems to me a meaningless point simply to talk about numbers, 73,000. What does it actually mean in reality? When you're sitting behind the desk as a minister, somebody who indeed did serve in the army, what do we mean when we talk about concerns about manpower? Because, for example, our aircraft carrier has, I think, a complement of about 800. It has effectively the same firepower as a US aircraft carrier with 4,000 people. Technology does mean that we don't necessarily need manpower.
Yeah, so there are two answers to that question. And the reality is there's a policy choice you've got to come somewhere in between. So it is definitely the case that a destroyer in the First World War would have had a ship's company of 600 or 700. A destroyer nowadays has a ship's company of 200. And in 20 years' time, I'd be amazed if the ship's company wasn't 100 or so. So there's a dividend that comes from all the automation, changes in propulsion. You don't need to physically shovel coal into a boiler anymore. And so in that sense, the number of people in your workforce makes no impact on fighting power. In fact, a destroyer today would easily take a destroyer from 1940. Easy. But mass has a quality all of its own. And there are some parts of defence where the simple reality is that one person cannot be in two places at one time. And no matter how much automation you achieve, if in 1 month you have a major weather event at home that causes lots of flooding across a corner of England, which means mobilising, let's say, kind of the 3 standby battalions, so 1,500 people to go and fill sandbags. There's no robots that can yet fill sandbags and do that. But at the same time, you've got major overseas exercises in parts of the world where the UK is competing for influence, and you've got ongoing operations across Europe, and you've got just the reality of people who've got family lives and everything else, and they can't always be away from home on active duty. Then you start to realise that you do need a critical mass. So people who arbitrarily say the armed forces must be 100,000 because if they're not, if the army must be 100,000, because if it's not 100,000, it's not a proper army.
Exactly.
That's a nonsense.
Right.
But actually being clear-headed about where does the dividend from automation stop, and just the hard reality of people not being able to be in two places at once come in.
2 more questions. The next question is obviously about technology. And this point, actually, that listeners are making, which is, we're not going to be invaded. But therefore, the emphasis has to be on things like cyber, counterattacks and that kind of thing. If Russia wanted to take down the UK, it would take down, for example, our national infrastructure with a cyber attack. So is the money being spent on big, heavy armour when a lot of it should be going into things, more amorphous things like cybersecurity?
So your contributor from Cheltenham...
No coincidence.
Exactly. That's exactly the point. That exposes the reality that it does not matter how external you make the review, how hard you think, how widely you consult. Ultimately, when it comes down to the political decisions at the end, if you choose to delete a class of ship, there are jobs that are dependent on that class of ship and all of the supply chain within it. If you choose to not invest in cyber capability, everybody in Cheltenham gets on the phone to people like you and reminds them the importance of cyber. So all of this ultimately comes down to a set of political decisions. Where I would take issue with either the GCHQ employee or the relative of a GCHQ employee who texts you is I have not seen... Defence reviews over the last 20 years made the mistake of concluding that the threat had moved. So at the end of the Cold War, it moved from state threat to counterinsurgency.
And now Ukraine shows boots on the ground.
And then it moved from... and then it moved to a sort of sub-threshold. It's all going to be around disinformation, cyber, whatever else. And then Ukraine happened. Actually, the threat envelope has just expanded.
Okay, final question.
You can't make trade-offs.
Which is this point, and very quickly, because we've got to go to the news, but it's basically NATO. I mean, we support the Americans in the Pacific and in the efforts to contain China. But really, given our size and our military, we can only really make an effective impact with our European allies defending the continent.
Wholly disagree.
Aha, good.
Because I don't think you can divide the Indo-Pacific from the Euro-Atlantic. I just think that's a nonsense. Globalization has happened, whether you like it or not. Supply chains are what they are. The European manufacturing base is so heavily now in the Far East that there is an interconnectedness and an interdependency between the theatres that means it's a fallacy to say they can be separated in terms of military strategy. I also think that the way that the US views NATO and Europe's contribution to it, the US is not simply looking for Europe to step up and have European security covered. The US can never turn its back on its Atlantic seaboard. So the US is always going to be a Euro-Atlantic actor. What people in Congress want to see is Europeans not just bank that the US Navy will keep the sea lines of communication to their Far East markets open gratis, and that we can all carry on selling BMWs or whatever to countries in that part of the world. They want to see European-flagged warships in the Straits of Malacca, in the South China Sea, contributing to Indo-Pacific security in return for America's contribution to Euro-Atlantic security.
Excellent. James Heappey, former Armed Forces Minister, thank you for coming in. and talking to us about that. That was an excellent interview, and I think we're going to get a lot of mileage from recently departed ministers who know what they're talking about on Times Radio in the future, who don't have to defend the government line anymore.